Hello everybody, I'm the Hearth Guy and it's good to be back doing something a little classic for this channel. Death Battle is a pretty big deal on the YouTube space, going from what was essentially just two dudes in a basement to being a major part of a multimedia company. The morality of said multimedia company was dubious on a good day, but hey, they're dead now. And now with it free and back on its own, I can feel happy bringing back this good old series. I've already done 5 videos covering every Lord or Lord-adjacent character from Fire Emblem as a way to spark imagination about what other Fire Emblem characters could be used well in that format. Naturally, with the heroes covered, I put up a poll a long time ago asking what you might want me to cover afterwards, and the answer was clear. I did Fire Emblem Heroes, so let's round it out with the villains. Let it not be said that I'm not a man of my word. First, my criteria. Each character must be a primary and regularly occurring villain, so no random bandits that show up only to be killed immediately afterwards. Secondly, I'm only covering true villains, not anti-heroes or heroes of questionable morality. I already talked about Edelgard and Rhea in the last Death Battle video. And of course, I will not be reusing characters for matchups. I will try to avoid reusing franchises, although as I learned in my last series, that's not always possible. And similarly, I will attempt to not use characters that Death Battle has used in the past, although those last two are more sets of guidelines than actual rules. It's just to give me a framework. Something to base my research off of. Anyone who saw my last series knows that they can be broken with ease if it means making a matchup that doesn't suck. But enough rules, let's get into the fun stuff. As we start way back where it all began in the Kaga era of games. Starting at the very beginning, we have Garnef, the very first villain to haunt Fire Emblem. And who better to throw his way than a classic villain who also served a Dark Master? Garnef vs. Saruman from Lord of the Rings. Formerly gifted beings of justice from ancient times that were known both for their power and their worrying lack of compassion for others. While not initially cruel, time eventually wore away at any kindness they had left, and they became servants to primordial kings of darkness that wished to subjugate the entire world. Through magical orbs possessing of foul magic, they use evil sorceries to inflict suffering upon those around them, corrupt once good monarchs, and raise an army to do war with the rest of the world for their kings. One could see this as a chance for Lich King vs. Sauron Part 2, but with its own spice to mix it up, particularly with the two characters being more magically based. I'll admit my knowledge of what Saruman can do is limited since the lore of Lord of the Rings is dense, but based on what I could learn, Saruman had a similar origin to Sauron, although of obviously different power. Though, ignoring any potential feats of raw power, as there appears to be generally little, Saruman could seemingly move about unheard or unseen and had a deep knowledge of magic and science. But most importantly was his voice, which could ensnare even the strongest of minds who listened to him. Only a small few had the will necessary to resist his voice and the power over the mind that he would force upon them. With the Palantir, he could see vast distances, although there is limited use for that in a death battle. As for Garnef, he is a sorcerer on the same level and even taught by Goto, a divine dragon and an ancient master of magic. Funnily enough, Goto himself would have been a decent matchup for Saruman pre-corruption, since he was known as the White Sage and was a servant of Naga, a being worshipped as a god. Garnef, however, is a master of dark magic, whose soul is tied to the Dark Sphere, a powerful artifact which can negate enemy attacks through possessing the mind of the attacker, apparently. It was only able to be countered by the presence of the Light Sphere, its natural opposite. Furthermore, with the Dark Sphere, Garnef crafted the spell Imhulu, which has the same effect as the Dark Sphere, unless countered by its direct opposite, the spell Starlight. And should you somehow kill Garnef, he has bound his soul to the Dark Sphere so he could be resurrected later, though this appears to be something that he can't do to himself, so it would not be particularly helpful in returning to the fight. However, due to Saruman's knowledge of magic, I don't doubt he could figure out some way to circumvent these abilities, although that's speculation. While clearly above the average person, I'm unsure if Garnef could even beat Saruman in terms of power. While clear examples of attacking power is uncertain for him, Saruman is still a Maiar, while Garnef is just a sorcerer with a couple of handy obstructions between him and death. Honestly, it's the general lack of information on either that makes determining who would win or how the fight would develop far more difficult. Although it's probably safe to say the Lord of the Rings character would have the advantage. Honestly, I couldn't tell you any kind of interesting interactions I could imagine between these two, except maybe Saruman outdoing all of Garnef's magic at every turn. Also, he doesn't rely on tomes like Garnef does. Regardless of how it turns out, it would be a spectacle of dark magic, and would be perhaps not as impressive, but perhaps reminiscent of Sauron versus the Lich King, which honestly we always need more of that. Next up, Hardin versus Artorias the Abyss Walker from Dark Souls. Once great heroes and knights that fought for the forces of light, but would in time become corrupted by the darkness they fought against, and have to be put down by younger heroes. Considered to be the greatest knight of Gwyn, Lord of Sunlight, Artorias was most famous for facing down and destroying the Abyss and its source, Manus. Of course, Artorias actually fell to the Abyss and was corrupted, and when you fight him in Dark Souls, he's not much better than a mad beast. Dark Souls being Dark Souls, it's a bit tough to math out Artorias' capabilities, but we can get some info from his lore. As one of the 4 Knights of Gwyn, Artorias was active during the war with the Ancient Dragons, and would have been responsible for killing his fair share. Take that and Artorias being directly comparable to the likes of Ornstein and the Chosen Undead, who Death Battle has covered before, and you might be able to figure out scaling through that. He faced down Manus, Father of the Abyss, and lost, but survived the experience, only to be corrupted by the Abyss. This reveals a certain level of weakness towards darkness as an element. Artorias pre-corruption would have had access to his Great Shield, which would ward away that darkness, but based off the type of matchup we're talking about and which version of him is most recognizable, I'd say he'd probably be in his Abyss-corrupted state, which has a broken arm, and no Great Shield. As for Hardin, he is a veteran warrior and Prince of Aurelis, whose king he is the younger brother of. After his brother fell ill, Hardin was granted power over the kingdom and began massive reforms, and generally became a hero to all. During the events of the very first Fire Emblem, he is leading a rebel army against the invading Empire of Dolor, during which he is protecting Princess Nina of Arcanea. But envy is sowed in his heart as he watches the young Marth gain favor and glory, as well as the attention of Nina. While by the end of the war, Hardin would ascend as Emperor of the new Arcanean Empire and marry to Nina, a loveless marriage leaves him open to Garnef's influence, and he is warped into the villain of the 3rd Fire Emblem game. Hardin, at his full corrupted power, wields the Dark Sphere, which we covered before with Garnef, and would prove to be hard for Artorias to fight through, especially in his fallen state without any sign of lightning that his fellow Dragon Slayers were known to use to deal with other damage-negating things like Dark Souls Dragon Scales. Similarly, Hardin's lance Gradavis is one of the 3 regalia, and is on par with Mercurius, a weapon I covered in the very first Fire Emblem Death Battle video, but to make a long story short, it's a very strong but not indestructible weapon with the power to totally heal Hardin of all damages, in exchange for some durability. Naturally, it'd be a question of if Artorias would be able to undermine the Dark Sphere or outlast Gradavis' durability. Personally, considering where Death Battle scaled the Chosen Undead, I'd say that he'd be able to, though I leave the matter of the Dark Sphere in the air, since, short of maybe corrupting Hardin with the Abyss, I don't know how Artorias would counter that. But I can see how the fight would go, as Artorias, even corrupted, seeks out those drenched in the dark around the Abyss, so he can be drawn to the darkness in Hardin and the Dark Sphere, leading to their fight. A dichotomy between Hardin and Artorias can be established, with Hardin appearing more lucid but being even more far gone than Artorias is, as even Artorias still remembers his noble intentions deep down. In the end, regardless of whoever you determine is the winner, they can have a thematic ending. Whether it's Hardin metaphorically killing the last raging bit of goodness inside him, or Artorias granting one person freedom from dark corruption, it'd be a rare case of catharsis in one of these theoretical death battles. Medeus, the very first evil dragon of Fire Emblem, against Ganondorf, one of the most iconic dark overlords in gaming. Age-old kings of often disgraced tribes whose defeat eons ago by a specific blade blessed by a goddess was the inciting moment for the majority of the world's story. A dark cult resurrects them, but they are ultimately defeated by a young hero descended from the same hero who defeated them in the first place, and by a princess who wields the power of light. Though perhaps starting good, watching the suffering of their people would slowly turn them to ideas of conquering the world and putting down all those who they deem as responsible for their people's sorrow. Ganondorf is a master of magic and swordsmanship whose power is amplified by the Triforce Shard he possesses. And even when that is not enough, the inner demon he has, known as Ganon, can awaken and tear apart the world. Ganondorf has been covered plenty of times by Death Battle and, well, he's Ganondorf. I don't think I need to explain him too much. He's a staple of pop culture. On their own, most of what I've researched shows Medeus overpowering Ganondorf, but once you include the Triforce of Power and his Ganon form, the scales start to sway more evenly. Ganon appears to be faster, but Medeus hits harder, and Medeus' magic is more limited compared to the wide range that Ganondorf has. Both are nominally immune to death, save for a unique magic sword, but Medeus does have a slight disadvantage with his Dragonstone. Should he lose it, he'd be unable to transform into his Dark Dragon form, greatly weakening him compared to Ganondorf. I think it'd be a pretty cool visual for Ganondorf to actually crush Medeus' Dragonstone before going in for the kill, but I do think Ganon would beat Medeus in the end, especially if accounting for the likes of Calamity Ganon. Still, a chance for cool hand-to-hand combat that can then turn into a kaiju fight sounds to me like a recipe for a memorable death battle. Berkut, Prince of Rigel versus Griffith from Berserk. Young warriors who represent the future and are heroes to their people, but slowly are broken down bit by bit, sacrificing the ones they love for power and running into the arms of dark godlike beings. It's better than Edelgard versus Griffith, at least, though I'm kind of meh on it. Pretty much anything involving Griffith bores me. Though with this matchup there's a chance for cool character interaction. Berkut's noble elitism, contrasted to Griffith's humble origins, could be used in the fight as a micro-version of Berkut's conflict with Alm. Being overpowered by one who he sees as inferior can push him to madness. That may spoil who I think would win, but come on, Griffith is clearly going to be the winner. The levels of feats are just not comparable between the two stories. Even at his peak, possessed by Duma with Witch Renea by his side, Berkut is making Griffith struggle at best, but he's not winning. Which is disappointing because I wish I could have found something better for Berkut. Maybe someone out there knows a better character to pair up with him, but I can't find it. Anyway, moving on to something better. Didn't expect to be back into Dark Souls so quickly, but here we are with Jeddah from Fire Emblem Guidance / Echoes, and Pontiff Sulivan, the foul tyrant of Irithyll, who plots to ruin the gods and bring about a new age of deep seas, born from the rot and consumption of those former gods. Prominent religious figures to hellish gods that represent the decay of their world's orders, whose very souls are forfeit to powers beyond them, all while they seek greater power in service to some distant and morally dubious future era that will be brought about by the ascension of the god they have become attached to. They corrupt and destroy those who work under them and infest the very centers of power in their countries, and become untouchable figureheads. Starting with Sulivan, he is a master of ice and darkness-based soul sorcery that is drawn from some darker power, especially since he's been corrupted by the profaned flame, which is imbued in one of his swords. He is resistant to poison and toxic effects as well as bleed and frost, but in turn he is weak to fire and lightning. As a sorcerer, he likely will have access to the frost-based spells Snap, Freeze, and Frozen Weapon, as he was the creator of those spells in the game. I could also see him being equipped with the Pontiff's left and right eye rings, which recovers a little bit of HP with successive attacks and boosts attacks as long as attacking persists respectively. Sulivan also can summon a spectral clone with most of the same abilities, which mirrors his future movements. While ultimately defeated by them, Sulivan was able to fight against the Ashen One, who is often compared to the Chosen Undead, so I would assume Death Battle would make similar comparisons. That said, while I think Sulivan has the base superior strength and speed, Jeddah has a lot of unique abilities that make things difficult. To start, he has no soul, so anything corruptive in nature would not work on Jeddah, since that was taken by Duma already. He can also use Conjure to summon monstrous moguls, which are balls of flesh with many eyes and tentacles. He can summon moguls indefinitely, as the act has no detriment to his HP like most magic would. He often possesses either the Draco Shield, which boosts his defense and allows for limited regeneration, or the Animus Ring, which also grants regeneration and gives access to Vengeful Cry, which lets Jeddah counter attacks from any range. Even without those items, he has the Incarnation skill that also grants regeneration, so he's doubling up on regenerative abilities here. He is also immune to all negative status effects, and the Pact skill removes the health requirements for any spells. Duma's Gift is perhaps his most frustrating skill to deal with, since it negates the first 3 attacks made against him in a turn, meaning that, over time, many of Sulivan's attacks would be ignored, even if he could push through to actually do damage to Jeddah. As an attack, Jeddah's primary magic is the Death Spell, which boasts high hit and low accuracy, which, as I said, he can cast freely without worrying for his HP. One could also presume he can cast any black magic, which basic Cantors and Dark Mages can, as he is clearly the highest of their rank. He has been shown to be able to freely teleport and have limited telekinesis, but he's far from all-powerful. Against holy and certain magical powers, he has been shown to be limited or weakened against them, such as against Celica's magic of both the holy and arcane sorts. His corruptive magic would also fail to work on Sullivan, who is already tainted by the profane flame, and one could argue the Abyss as well. Jeddah also isn't near as proficient in close-range combat, which Sullivan can easily handle, but Jeddah's ability to summon endless hordes of moguls could either overwhelm Sullivan, or if they're determined to be too weak to be a real problem, could just prove to be healing fodder for his Pontiff's left eye ring. Add that to Sullivan's clone ability and the specificity of Jeddah's defensive measures, and I think the usurper Sullivan would defeat the Dark Priest Jeddah. How would it go down? Well, as a servant or perhaps puppeteer behind Aldrich, Devourer of Gods, Sullivan would seek out Duma as a god fit to be eaten by the Great Devourer, only to be halted by Jeddah, which leads to the fight. A distinction between the two can be made throughout the fight. While Jeddah is someone who has sacrificed everything for his dark god, Sullivan has never known sacrifice or loss, and so stands far above him in his drive and ambitions. He is a man who has never felt the crush of defeat, and therefore it is not even a possibility in his mind. I think you could pull some interesting things with that differing mindset, and of the possible death battles, at least in this video, it's the most philosophically unique. You know, it's kind of interesting that Dragon Age Origins and Fire Emblem Echoes turned out to have some thematically appropriate pair-ups between two of the main heroes and villains alike, although to call either Duma or the Archdemon villains is a bit of a misnomer. Yeah, they're the driving destructive forces in each game, but they're little more than blighted and maddened gods of an older era, now mindlessly spreading destruction and plague throughout the land via evil magic. One commands legions of soulless husks, terrors, and former humans turned dark mages, and the other leads endless hordes of blighted darkspawn that are unified only in the shared hive mind of the archdemon Urthimiel. Urthimiel is far from the strongest of the archdemons in Dragon Age lore, and in fact it's possible that he's the weakest of all the old gods, as he was the old god of beauty compared to the likes of Dumat, the first archdemon, who was the head of the old gods of Tevinter. Even so, Urthimiel led a surprisingly well-coordinated army of magical plague-spreading darkspawn. Said plague would likely do nothing to Duma or his own forces, half of which are undead monsters, but his human servants could be blighted and become controlled by the archdemon as ghouls. Maybe. It's possible that not having souls would negate that whole thing. Any of those corrupted darkspawn are under his thrall and can actually be detonated as suicide bombers from long range, dealing physical damage to everything. It can breathe out or call down balls of corrupted spiritual energy to deal spirit damage, and create a swirling vortex of that same energy, which proceeds to heal all darkspawn within the vortex. It also causes a 25 speed debuff and 30% debuff to attack power and defense to its enemies. Darkspawn within suffer 30% elemental weakness, although the code suggests this was not an intended effect. Duma, meanwhile, stands far above Urthimiel nominally, as in ancient times he was on par with Naga, the supreme divine dragon of Arcanea. Even if he was ultimately defeated by her, as a divine dragon he could only be harmed by another dragon's fangs and claws, which manifest as his weakness to the falchion. But Duma's best days are behind him, as his mind and body have grown rotten and maddened over the eons, and he seeks to create a world of Darwinian virtues centered on ambition and self-centeredness, his soul appearing as a large eyeball protruding from his rotten dragon body. This eye can release a powerful ocular beam, which technically is considered black magic, which makes sense as most of these spells and echoes are tied back to him. He also has the Oculus attack, which when used it prevents enemies counterattacking. Combine that with his ability to summon necro-dragons, which are dangerous enough on their own without holy magic that Urthimiel is severely lacking, and Duma's own army appears to largely be more dangerous than the archdemons. Even if the Darkspawn were more of a threat, Duma's upheaval skill causes widespread damage across the field, which would whittle away at the Darkspawn horde, while Duma can keep summoning more. The Archdemon's Blight can only heal so many at a time, while Duma just replaces whatever is lost. And debuffs aren't much of a worry for Duma due to the immune status skill that, like it sounds, makes him immune to negative status effects. And even if that's down, his body produces tentacles to use as bludgeoning weapons, and he still is, a dragon. Claws and teeth and all that. It's because of this that I believe Duma would be the victor between these diabolically despotic drakes. Of course, it doesn't take much brain work to figure out how a fight between them would start, since their whole shtick is world domination and destruction, so either way, they'll run into each other and try to murder each other. There also isn't much of a chance for character moments, except some from Duma, but neither are real chatty. Still, probably the fight I'd like to see most out of this batch. This is one that I'm not very pleased to do. Arvis versus Ozai from Avatar: The Last Airbender. Yeah. It was that or Cinder from Ruby, which... no. Or Endeavor from MHA, which was never going to happen either. On the surface, it may seem like a logical matchup, two rulers who lead destructive conquests across the world who are abysmal fathers, who only want to continue their lineage, only to be undone in the end as a result of their children either directly or indirectly stabbing them in the back. My problem with this matchup is simply the fact that Ozai has a single instance of combat, and that's when he's boosted by Sozin's Comet, which would make actually determining anything about him very difficult. He's just an impractical character to put up into the death battle matchup, and he doesn't have enough cool feats to use for it. And ignoring that, Arvis just wins. Man is dropping meteors, the very thing that Ozai is using to power up, and last I checked, if Ozai couldn't beat Aang when he was holding back, then he is not beating a guy who can level entire armies without some celestial power-up. Next. Veld vs. Ankano from Elder Scrolls, because Veld does technically count as a main villain, even if he is a very lame one. Veld is a basic dark mage, which has a regeneration skill that is relatively negligible. And he wields dark spells like Jormungandr and Hell, the latter of which reduces the enemy's HP to 1. Although Ankano knows some of the best self-healing magic, so that is kind of undone instantly. The cherry on top of that weak sundae is Veld's magic has limited uses, so he's cooked in the long run. Veld's best weapon is the Petrify spell, and while it would be an instant win, that requires it to actually hit, as Ankano can use wards to block most spells. And as an Altmer, his Magicka can regenerate faster than an average person from Tamriel too, so he has even greater sustainability compared to Veld than most from his own world would have. I really don't care about either of them, but as magical servants to religious nationalist movements who cause a relatively small catastrophe by manipulating others, it's as good as either deserve. Okay, now this one's probably one of the better matchups for either of these characters. Julius versus Alucard from Castlevania. Sons of great villains who, whether they follow the path of good or sink even deeper into darkness, betray their fathers and seek to change the world by their innate power. One is born half monster, but becomes a beacon of good by nurturing his humanity, and the other is born as a scion of two holy lineages and becomes a force of evil by allowing corruption to overtake his soul. Right out of the gate, Alucard has an enormous experience advantage compared to Julius, unless we consider Loptis as a part of Julius, which I could see an argument for. Although Alucard certainly has greater mental stability than either Julius or Loptis. Beyond that, Alucard possesses several unique abilities, amongst which are various elemental magics, traveling at super speed and teleportation, telekinesis, and a whole host of other abilities tied to specific weapons, armors, and shields. He can shapeshift freely and has a history of being able to undermine and kill superior dark forces, which could apply to Loptis just as it would to other evil beings. This could also prove to be a weakness to Julius, as the blood of Loptis within him boosts certain attributes for him and allows him to use dark magic, and could be exploited by Alucard due to his powers and training. As ever, I'm unsure how the Nihil skill, which negates an enemy's skills, would respond to Alucard's many abilities. Honestly, it's a very difficult skill to translate into a death battle, as I covered in my previous death battle series. On a simpler note, he possesses the Leg Ring, which is funny to say out loud, which increases movement and likely would translate into greater speed, if anything. His Wrath skill translates to increased attack power when he's heavily injured, but becoming that injured is rare for Julius due to his Tome of Loptis. The book halves the damage of all incoming attacks before his defenses are also applied, and it further boosts magical resistances. The lore effect of the tome allows Loptis to possess Julius directly and channel his power through it, a power which could shake a continent with just his dying breath. Normally, the only thing that can negate this power is the Book of Naga, but considering Alucard has a history of negating such supernatural defenses, such as with his many fights against his father and death itself, then I think it makes sense he could negate these defenses too. Julius would be a dark reflection of what Alucard could have become, but in the end it's his ability to control his own mind as well as his experience with foes just like Julius that would end with Alucard seizing victory. And that is that for the Kaga era of games and their associated villains. Next time I will move on to the Pre-Awakening series of games and their villains, so I hope you stick around for that. A shout out to my patrons. If you want to directly support the channel and join the wall of lovely people here, make sure to either become a member or, as these people have, join my Patreon. In both cases, you get access to a private Discord where you can all hang out quietly and peacefully, and you can get early access to plenty of my videos hours or even days earlier than YouTube, as well as direct contact with me and a chance to give feedback or suggestions. With that all said and done, I am the Hearth Guy, and I will see you all next time around the hearth.